Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Polity Podcast. I'm Alex Denley here with Dr. Andrew Jones.
Hello.
And we're not doing Politics of Paganism. We are done with that series, but back in the podcast studio, and we're talking about your new book, which is now here, available for order, The Church Against the State. So available at newpolity.com/press.
Right.
Also available on Amazon, but please buy
don't.
from us.
Only if
Don't
you
give
must.
Amazon more money if we can. So first of all, this is a major accomplishment, this book, and it's very interesting because I was seeing the essays as they came out, and I was your student at Franciscan at the time, both in undergrad and then as grad student at Franciscan University, and it's really amazing to see the essays all collected here, and really the development of a very serious Catholic political theory, which is based ultimately in subsidiarity. And there's a claim you make at the beginning of the book that I want to highlight here, which is that subsidiarity is not just like our Catholic, it's not just like, the Catholic version of politics. We like subsidiarity, other people like other things.
Right.
But you make the claim that subsidiarity is actually the form of justice itself. And maybe we could start with that and what you mean by this, what Catholic social teaching says, politics should be aimed towards the common good and ultimately produce a structure of subsidiarity.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's massively difficult. Just jump right. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. What do I mean? Well, maybe the common good is a good place to start, actually, understanding what it means. I mean, one of the sort of obvious problems with the common good is that normally or often people will treat the common good as a sort of the good of the whole. So something like, stepping back and saying, okay, the whole of society is achieving some sort of objective, and the common good is that objective, and then all the different components within that society that's achieving the objective have like a participation or a little share of that common good. But the common good it's a parts to whole understanding. You see what I'm saying? So there's something like the common good is prosperity, the common good is peace, the common good is even like a justice system or something like that works. And it's almost like the common good being there understood as sort of the conditions of thriving or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's not completely wrong, obviously. But the problem with it is that within such a framing, what we're missing is that the common good is not the summation of the goods that are achieved within society, but rather we have to understand that the common good is something that is enjoyed by everyone in its totality. All right, so what I mean is if the common good is achieved, what makes it common is not that it's something that's a product of cooperation, although it is. Mm-hmm. What makes it common is that the good that is achieved is actually enjoyed by all the participants.
Right.
Okay. So they're not enjoying components of it. They're enjoying it itself.
Okay.
All right. So when and a just society is a society in which, in the ideal, to the extent that a society is just, is maybe the way we can say that, is a society that to the extent that it's just, to that same extent, the individuals within it are enjoying the common good. Just happiness, right? Mm-hmm. Happiness, human flourishing, whatever that may be. Now, the reason why that matters for subsidiarity, is that you can't now imagine society as a sort of structure of stones that are built up into some edifice, and that it's only the total edifice that achieves the good, the common good, and each of the components only are components within that thing. You can't imagine it that way. You have to instead attempt to imagine how it is that each of the components is a whole in of itself. So each of the components is in some way the good of the whole is manifested in each of the components, or is real in each of the components. in a non-diminished way, in the full sense that the people who are occupying the different components of society are in fact in their occupation of those components enjoying the common good.
Right. Like the different classes of each. It's not just the elites are enjoying a greater common good and the lower levels are supplying that common good. It's
which is I think, like we talked about in the Politics of Paganism, something like what Aristotle comes to, right? That the guys at the top are enjoying
all the fruits of
all the less. As you go down the hierarchy, the way you get out of the problem is that you say basically people are less human as you descend, and therefore their enjoyment of the good is less full because they're more approaching the animal, right? Whereas from a Christian perspective, we want to insist that every person within the social whole is a person and enjoys therefore the common good, the end in its fullness. Not a piece of it that then adds up to the elite group at the top who gets to enjoy friendship and happiness and virtue and all the things that you have at the top.
Right.
Right. And so this means that we have to have an understanding of, if we're going to understand justice, then we have to understand that each of the pieces are a microcosm of the whole. So the good that is achieved by the whole is instantiated, manifest, ultimately only subsistent, and only actually ultimately exists in the lives of the smaller pieces, all the way down to the life of the individual person. Mm-hmm. Right.
And in a certain sense, you can describe this by where is the place where human happiness is most proximate or enjoyed closest, and that's in the family, right? Like the enjoyment of that common good happens at the closest level, and then the argument of subsidiarity is actually that the higher levels of authority exist to benefit and provide the conditions for the family.
Yeah, and that can be really misunderstood, right? Because you can say that, and then we can think the family's perfect, or the family or a grouping of friends, but the point being an intimate gathering, right? Like a person-to-person interaction. That you can say, oh, that's perfect, and then everything else is just subservient to it. Everything else just serves it, and that's wrong. That's a wrong way to understand it, because what we're saying is what we're ultimately saying is that the realm of interpersonal interactions is actually the only place that actually exists.
Oh, right.
Like, everything else is an abstraction, right? So the realm of actual personal interactions is actually the matter, the thing, the thing that's formed is the people,
right?
Right, and the people only exist where their bodies are.
Mm-hmm. Right? Plato makes this point.
They don't exist anywhere else. Yeah,
the polity is just the friendships.
Right. What else would it be? Right. What else would it be? And you end up saying things like the city this and the city's good and the city, as if the city is a thing. And it's like, but it's not. It's just where does the city reside? Where does it exist? And it's like, well, where it exists is in the people, the persons, and that means it exists in their relationships. Right, that if it's the social thing, which is the city, exists within the relationships, and so that doesn't. So it doesn't. What subsidiarity? I think a good understanding of subsidiarity wouldn't then think that you have this idea that the smallest thing, if it could just be left alone, it'd be great. And then, but because of all the sort of problems it deals with, we have to build these bigger apparatus that is a support mechanism for the smallest thing. That's not the point. Mm-hmm. The point is that the smallest thing, meaning real interpersonal human relationships, achieve their own fulfillment or their own end, their own completion, which is in the common good, only through their participation in greater levels of order. Right. So this can be imagined fairly easily. It's an example I've given before in other podcasts, I think, but maybe it's appropriate to do it again, where you can imagine a family, an isolated family, Swiss Family Robinson or something, like an isolated family, And they can have a degree of happiness there, just in the same sort of way that an isolated human being could have a degree of happiness, if nothing else, to the extent that he exists and is alive, right? But and that's real. That's a real thing. But the family will be happier and will move deeper into human fulfillment if there's another family there. Right? If the conversation over true and false, just and unjust, beautiful and ugly, the true, the good and the beautiful, if those discourses become integrated into another mode of life, another way of seeing the infinite complexity of the world and formulating it, right? And that the conversation thickens, and that conversation thickens in the family. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, because there's another family or two other families or three other families and we're all interacting with each other, because of that, the actual conversation at the dinner table around with the original family is more full, more beautiful, more saturated with truth. Do you see? And therefore participating ever deeper into the common good. Mm-hmm. So that extends into higher levels of order, higher levels of interaction, right? Where the justice or the goodness of the higher levels cascade into and are lived down, they cascade down into and are lived in the particular instantiation of those higher things in actual life. Right, in actual life. And so that's where it's actually found. Where is the city found? It's found in the citizens. Mm-hmm.
And
right?
I just want to add to that point that it's not in that example of the Robinson Crusoe family that then their happiness increases by the presence of other families to communicate and grow in friendship.
Yeah.
But it's not a destruction of the family itself, right? Like it's not
a thickening of it. It's a making of it ever even more perfect.
So the difference of the two is not, let's say, perfectly overcome into a homogeneous, they become individualized or something like that.
Well, if that
they retain their status as family and are elevated into something higher. And it's the same with friendship.
That's the way friendship works, right?
So you retain the difference between each other and are growing beyond both of you. But it is never a total destruction of the difference of the two. It's a deepening of. That's what friendship maintains, that distance, we could say.
The alterity, the difference, the otherness of the friend is the content of friendship. I mean, it's like what friendship is the coming together of two persons, different persons, and and there is a growing together, but that growing together is not the homogenization of or the conforming of one to the other. That is a master-slave relationship, right? Where the one lives according to the rationality of the other, right? The friend relationship is one in which I image myself in you, you image yourself in me. And so we're growing together, but we're growing together as images of the other in ourselves, not in ourselves. Right. I know that's complicated, but like the way in which my potentialities are activated by you, the relationship between you and me is distinct, bears both of us in our totality. I mean, like the result of that is both of us, right? Not one submitting or conforming to the other, and that relationship, the construction of that relationship, is what builds a world, a shared world, right? And a shared world is, I think, understanding, a world in which we live requires that difference between us. That's what makes it a shared world. I live in a world where somebody who's different than me also is experiencing this shared space. Do you see? And that's what makes that space real, right? If the other is merely a duplicate of me, is merely a duplication, a submission to my will, my desires, my truths, then the world that I share with that person is still just in my own head, right? It's not shared. And in fact, I don't really know what world that person is occupying, right? Do you know what I mean? We're caught in a competition between worlds at that point.
Right. And I think this is a natural place to then move to, just brilliant essay, Priority of Peace, because there you're drawing out the difference between this friendship relationship, which you see chiefly and drawing on Aquinas in the father-son relationship, and a comparison of that of the master and slave relationship. And this same dynamic where in the master-slave relationship, as you draw out, it is the conformity to the world of the master on behalf of the slave. And so there's, and I think, as you're saying, there's a fear that the world of the slave is not entirely the world of the master.
Oh no, I think it's necessarily dishonest, right? Because, or at least not complete. So because the slave conforms to the will of the master for reasons, right? And those reasons are not comprehended by the master. I mean, they're not a part of the master's commands. Do you see what I'm saying? Like he occupies a world that's structured by his rationality, and it compels the slave to conform to that rationality, but the slave does so for reasons that lay outside of it. So he does so, for whatever, because of the pleasures that he wants to enjoy or the fears that he wants to avoid, whatever the reasons are for his conformity, they're not the master's reasons, right? For whatever project they're engaging in. So he's necessarily holding something in reserve, the slave.
Oh, right.
You see what I'm saying? And therefore there's a break in the world between the two. There's a disjuncture between the two. And this is a space that the political theorists of antiquity saw. Right, so if you look at like Cicero or someone who will see that are the gods real? Well, no, of course not. But it's necessary that the masses think so, and we as the elites, as the masters, need to maintain a different world for the slaves to live in than we live in. Right, there's an understanding that the social order, the social structure is a series of incompatible laws or incompatible social visions, so incompatible worlds, phenomenal worlds that are tenuously and sort of opportunistically manipulated or held together. Do you see, like that is something I think the pagans become very aware of when they treat politics in a practical way.
So then you have a world in which the elites are living in, where they know the gods are false, and they're structuring the order so that the people are happy, and then the people are living in a different world, and therefore there's no friendship really there because they're not operating within a shared. I mean, there's some level of friendship, but no, they're not operating in a shared world that's growing. They're actually stacked on top of each other in a certain type of way.
Yeah, and it becomes exploitive. Yeah. So the thing is that the Christian conception of the common good, and therefore of subsidiarity, is a conception in which the pursuit of the whole, the pursuit of the good of the whole, is the pursuit of the good of all of the pieces, and therefore the movement into that good is a movement that brings every component together. They're not in competition with each other, right? Whereas in the master-slave relationship, the goods pursued by the slave and the goods pursued by the master are in competition with each other, right? And there's little bits of sophistry that ancients throw in there to try to make that not the case, but they always result in they always ultimately are that the slave is not really a human being. I mean, ultimately that's the conclusion. He's not, you know what I mean? He's not fully a human being, and therefore you treat him like you would treat like an ox. And the good of the ox is compatible with the good of the farmer, in the sense that the ox is made to serve the farmer. Right, that's his end. And so you end up with that kind of stuff, how which is I think not only wrong theologically but wrong philosophically. I think it's like I said, I think it's sophistry.
And setting this up with subsidiarity, and then the opposition here is sovereignty, and really in a sense, it's encapsulated in that master-slave relation, or the bringing about of that type of there's not really shared worlds that are happening. A shared world in which you're growing. It's an open world in which the common good is deepening through friendships, building a common world together. Mm-hmm. But really, the imposition from above of a particular world, and really, this is your takedown really of Hobbes and his whole world and anthropology and political theory that he develops out of it, particularly in your essay, The Kingdom of Darkness. Mm-hmm. And so maybe we could move to sovereignty then, and the Hobbesian anthropology and theory that he's developing here, because it really does seem to be the most perfect system of masters and slaves, if I could preempt the discussion a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's so perfect that the master himself dissolves, right? And everybody's a slave. right. The master becomes Leviathan, becomes this corporate thing. I mean, I guess the anthropology is, I mean, to make this very simple, and I think the essays are less simple, I hope, but we got to try to articulate it verbally. That if you imagine that basically that human persons don't exist. Okay, so the human person, the human individual is not constituted as himself in and through his relationships, but is somehow prior to those relationships. All right, so you're going to have you're going to imagine individuals first, and then ask the question, how is it that they come together? Right? If that's your procedure, which I think is Hobbes's procedure, and actually the procedure that underwrites all modern sovereignty, I think. And then you end up with a situation, I think inevitably, where those individuals are entering into the social world for reasons. Okay, there are reasons to be a part of it. And that makes all the difference, because if there are reasons to be a part of it, then that means that there's some form of rationality or judgment or world that's prior to it, right? Mm-hmm. Do you see what, like,
it's not that man is already born into a social reality for Hobbes. It's in fact that he's an individual before entering into the social world.
Yeah, and Hobbes pushes that all the way back to infancy. To being an infant, it doesn't matter. I mean, so we don't even have to talk about there being an actual temporal. It's not like the individual's here and then time the next, later in time he does this. It can be logical that this is the way it is. Like, the individual is always, so for Hobbes, the individual is always already in a social thing, but he is in that as an individual who is prior to it. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So he's in the social reality as one who is attempting to somehow maximize his interests over and against the social thing. Right. And that once you do that, then you end up with a situation where, well, everybody's conception of reality, everybody's conception of true and false, of justice, of what's good, can't be realized, right? Because they are they have no bridges between them, right? They're fundamentally individualized and atomized. There's no shared reality that unites them at a metaphysical level, right? And that means that the shared reality that becomes built is always going to be the victory of, or the conquest of, one of those conceptions over the others, and the submission of others to that one, mm-hmm. right? Which is the master-slave relationship. Now Hobbes is brilliant, right? And so he comes to understand and articulate that when the way that in fact plays out over time is that no one man's world becomes the world. right? But rather the corporate whole in the very struggle for the realization of your conception of reality, the very struggle between the individuals, always results in the construction of a social world that stands over and against all the individuals, right? And all the individuals are submitting to this thing that no one man controls, right? Which means everybody's a slave, right? Everybody's holding something in reserve, right? Which is, and that something can be very deep, but it's always there.
Because in order for the individual who does become supreme to have power, it has to be some type of concessions from everyone lower than him, and his power is intimately bound up with the whole of the state, or the whole of the Leviathan, and he has to appease all of their individual desires that then become expressed, and maybe even to return to the beginning moves, that he presumes the individual desires to possess the whole of the world for himself, to basically have the whole world be his world.
To be God.
It's to be God. Right? Yeah. The first move of Hobbes is to say every man desires to be the God of all reality.
Yeah, that's right.
And now, however, there are other men out there. Now, that presents a problem because they, given this fundamental anthropology of Hobbes, they also desire to be the God of all of reality. And this is where the individual really becomes social through the battle with the other individual.
Yes, right.
Because and this is exactly, what you were saying about the primary relationality of being, really, that becomes present in subsidiarity. It is the complete opposite of the fundamental reality of being as relational to assert that you start as individual and the first relation with the other is violence and warfare. Like, that is the construction of the social. Like, that's really, right. in an ontology sense, couldn't be more opposite or opposed.
It is the diametric opposite, yeah. But it ends up, though, it ends up in that's why I call it the kingdom of darkness. It ends up in a sort of perverted version of the same. I mean, what I mean is that it ends up where people's existence, their personalities, their virtues and vices, their aesthetics, their desires are all wrapped up in the struggle, and are all part of the negotiation. So when we say that the individual comes to conform or submit to that which is more powerful, and he's doing so for his own reasons, that's true. But that submission for Hobbes is not merely extrinsic. The submission becomes intrinsic. Do you see what I mean? Like, the pursuit of my own desires, the pursuit of my own survival, at some point is maximized by my internal submission to the other, like my actual internalization and acceptance of the power's conception of true and false as true and false. Now, I'm not faking it when I say it's true or false. Do you see what I come to actually concede the most power which I have, which is my own will, or my own actual power, my ability to affect the world, that itself is up for negotiation, right? That itself is sort of for sale. It has a price to it. And that price is ultimately paid. I mean, what I mean is like the Leviathan ultimately successfully demands the submission all the way through, all the way down in the individual, and the individual ultimately concedes it.
Right.
Okay, so that means that the individual as encountered in the world is a socially constructed creature. All right, so
who is entirely the product of power and concessions.
Which is like Foucault. Micropower, the power that operates not just in the sort of extrinsic legal juridical order, but that operates in language and norms and in social pressures and in the conceptions of virtues and vices, all of those sorts of things. Now, Hobbes knows all that already.
Right. And I know we're moving at 10,000 mile per hour pace, but to move to Foucault and Discipline and Punish, it's really what's very interesting about your treatment of the postmoderns and particularly of Foucault is that what you're saying is they are the hyper moderns, in a sense that they take the insights that are present there in Hobbes and make it as Foucault will say, that the soul is the prisoner of the body, right?
Right.
Like that in a sense, that power dynamic that you're presenting there in Kingdom of Darkness, those structures that go all the way down from the state in every man to the deepest levels, that what Foucault's doing in Discipline and Punish is showing how it all works, how the conformity of the body through disciplines, through all the structures that he goes through, the development of the hospital, of the military, the military discipline that arises, the economic discipline of capitalism and industrialization, that Foucault's project is showing you this turn in the development of the nation state and then capitalism and the rest of it, of first of all, of individualizing the subject as best you can. Mm-hmm. So removing all of the barriers to seeing what the actual desires of the individual are, and then disciplining them through certain structures to conformity to the ends of which the state wants.
Yeah, and that discipline and that conformity is all the way through. That's why the soul is the thing that Foucault will talk about, all the way to the soul. So it's not extrinsic, it's intrinsic discipline. And that, I think, is just taking the Hobbesian world and focusing in on identifying and focusing in on the actual ground of power. So the Leviathan, the actual ground, the actual basis of the Leviathan's power is that conformity at the level of the soul. Right? This is the reason that its commands are obeyed. Do you see what and somewhat willingly. Do you see? Right? Yeah. And that is, I mean, I think that's what Foucault is doing. It's brilliant and very insightful because it shows the master-slave relationship it shows the depth of the level of the depth of the conformity that's possible, and the depth of the submission that's possible. But even in Foucault, something's being held in reserve, because even in Foucault, you have this sense that there's some tragedy here, right? That something something is being destroyed. That this person who has become the perfect slave is sad. Do you see? Right? Like there's some even there. I mean, he even as much as he would like to try to not be a critic, he ends up being one. And this is bad, right? Yeah. Right, and that.
Well, I think it's the residual humanity left in Foucault.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
You
he
can find,
can't quite escape his Catholicism.
Yeah, I don't know if
deep
you've
downside, he went to catechism class. Somewhere.
He was an altar boy.
Yeah,
he was.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen his discussion with Noam Chomsky.
Maybe I have.
Yeah, it's on YouTube for people who want to find it, but it's very interesting between these two leftists, you could say. But one of them has basically. And this is the thing that postmodernism all the way down ends in the same modern problems. I think that's part of what you're saying here.
Yeah.
But between Chomsky, who still holds on to let's say the positive side of Marxism and liberation, that there is the possibility of liberation, right? What the postmodern project in a certain sense is, no, there's not, right? Like no liberation really is possible. And it was interesting in this discussion between them that Foucault, when you work out all of the granted an escape of being from its relational reality and this power dynamics all the way through, you have no possibility of liberation of the subject. The subject really is just what is constructed by power.
That's right. Yeah, but at that point, you're in a paradox. I mean, it's so tedious to almost even point it out, but you're in the paradox of post-liberalism or postmodernism itself having to be a part of the power structure. I mean, like there is no vantage point from which to evaluate it, to see it, to judge it. If that's the case, then we're done. I mean, you might just surrender, right?
Why bother writing the big books?
Why bother doing any of it? Yeah, and so I think that they don't ever actually go that far personally. That's what I mean by even with Foucault, he still holds something back even in the individual person, right? He still sees that there's something there, and has a sense of something having been lost, right? Like very much so that there's and this is one of the things that Foucault sometimes criticized for being a conservative, because there's definitely in his writing the sense that things have gotten worse.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
The whole narrative of his books work by,
and if that's the
gets
case,
worse.
if it's getting worse, then you've introduced some sort of metaphysical reality that is prior to or underneath the power dynamics.
Yeah, and just as an aside, it's fascinating because the fourth volume of History of Sexuality it came out more recently, but it actually is the one time in Foucault's work it seems as though his "it gets worse" thing reverses, because he's talking about the Church Fathers. Yeah, and
which
their view of sexuality.
Really wrong about.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't read the Church Fathers right, but like even talking about the Church Fathers, you can see that there's, anyways. So,
but see, Hobbes doesn't do that. So Hobbes thinks that, I mean, well, Hobbes sometimes falls into normative stuff, but for the most part, he thinks that the world has always been nothing but absolute power. Like in the war between them, and the individual is constituted in the power dynamics. That's what the person is, and that's it. I mean, always has been and always will be. Right. So.
Yeah, and there's no history there,
There's no history. Yeah, there's no.
It just cycles through things.
It's just like, well, that's why he wants it to be a science, like a physics, a physics where you've determined the fixed condition, and then you can analyze the moving pieces within the fixed laws. Yeah.
So what I want to move to now then would be your claim, which about sovereignty, that sovereignty isn't just a bad theory. It's completely wrong, right? Like it doesn't actually describe reality.
That's right.
Right. So this first anthropological move where being is not relational, but rather you're an individual prior to sociality is wrong. Like it's not a description of reality.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So I how to begin there?
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess at some level we start with our everyday experiences, don't you think? At some level, you start with, and it maybe sometimes this annoys people because it sounds sentimental or something, but I think philosophy always at some level just begins with our everyday intuitions and observations. That the mother really does love her child. Like that's real. And like it's self-sacrificial, like loves her child. And this is like von Balthasar's insight, that love of the mother for the baby is the baby's first awakening to the reality of the world, right? The experience of the love and the return of it. And that he talks about it. It's really a beautiful thing where he talks about it as the mother's smile, and the first time that the baby returns the mother's smile. And that the idea is this thing that love constitutes its object. So love presupposes the thing that it loves, but really the loving itself creates the thing that it loves. All right, so loving presupposes and then constitutes the object of love, which is sort of mysterious, I think, right? But that child experiencing the love of the mother comes to love her, and when that occurs, then there's a shared world. Right. And that's the child's awakening to its own personality, that I am not the cosmos itself. Right. Like does the infant understand that it's not God? Right. Like the newborn infant. Right. And it's like, well, the mother, it seems to be the mother's love for that child is what opens the world as something other than me and the existence of this other person. Who shares this world with me and who I trust. I'm not at war with, I'm not in competition with, but I'm bound together in this shared world is what creates the world. Right? That's the argument. Like that's what creates the world. It requires love, not war. War is a conflict between worlds. But the experience, the reality of love. And so is that reducible? Can we prove that? I don't know. I think that we know it's true. Like I know that when I think about my friendships, my relationships with my wife, with my children, with my friends, that of course there's all the kinds of power dynamics and sin and all the sorts of things that Hobbes and Foucault and those guys are talking about are there. You can see them, right? But all of those things are operating within a social world that is somehow prior to and is opposed to those violences, those acts of violence, right? Like that's why we perceive them as violence.
Right.
Right. I mean,
the initial, and well, we can compare this to Hobbes, but the initial giving away of self in love to the even the infant, that then is love first as a donation or a gift to the other, that then leaves oneself vulnerable to betrayal if the other has freedom.
Yep.
But is looking for response from that love, and then the experience of being loved gives you the basis for that response, and then that grows. Right now, let's talk about Hobbes and that initial mother-child relationship. He can only say, well, the first act of the mother in relation to the child is, do I kill it?
That's what he says.
And that
I kill it or not? If I don't kill it, then I've made it my slave. And
he has to do that because of his theory, which is the encounter of the individual and the other individual, even if it's mother and child, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, one of the most relational relationship you can have between two persons of mother and child. This so deep relationship. Hobbes has to just. Everything else doesn't matter except for my theory's understanding of the individual. Love can't fit in any of this.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't exist. Yeah, it's not real. But so what? But I think what my argument would be is that sovereignty, that kind of power, to the extent that it's realizable. So to the extent that mastery is really capable of being realized, it's actually preying upon that deeper reality. Okay, so it's actually threatening or promising goods to that deeper world that exists prior to it, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a predatory, imperialistic or parasitic movement, and it operates something like this, I guess I would say, or try if I'm trying to simplify it, is that there's in the construction of shared worlds with common goods, you have, we talked earlier about like the family, and then it's coming to share a world with other families, and then they're coming to share a world with other neighborhoods, and and there's this whole subsidiarity kind of idea of the growth, and that growth is just like how the mother-child relationship is. The growth is the coming together of two to create a new reality. And that's what you see happening even within larger levels of social order. Well, that dynamic is not already completed, meaning there's gaps between these groupings. There's real gaps between these groupings, and they're gaps that are dangerous. I mean, they're gaps where like you don't know between my family and your family. Where do we meet? What can we talk about? There's a space there, right? And that space is unsocialized, right? It's sort of a wilderness, or it's in a real sense lawless, right? And that's the space that power, sovereign power, sets up shop
in the gaps,
in those gaps, and in that space, then it's capable of constructing sort of mediating institutions or mediating power dynamics, however I want to put it, that presents the family or the community, the village, whatever is the thing that is the unit we're talking about, as vulnerable, as under threat, as needing some sort of rewards. Right, like it, and the other grouping that is on the other end of the gap is not us, but is a threat to us, or is or a source of goods for us. Like if we can, that sovereign power dynamic that comes in, then it thrives in fragmentation, in division, right? But it requires the goods that subsist within those entities, and that's its fuel, right? The reason why men go to fight for it is because they love their family, right? You see what I'm saying? Like the reason why, the sovereign is mining, is maybe a way of putting it, or preying upon those common goods that are actually held, and that if those aren't there, it fails. The power fails, and that's why it's caught in this trap where the increasing of fragmentation increases the space that the sovereign gets to operate. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, wow,
okay. Yeah. So because is the sovereign operating in the family? No. But if I can divide the family up into individuals, now there's gaps between them. Now the power gets to seep in there, right? And occupy now the gaps between the individuals. And so it's expanding the scope of its power, but at the same time, it's weakening the goods that are available for it to mine. Do you see what I mean? It's weakening its ability. So its expansion is also its weakening. You see what I'm saying? Like there's a paradox, and it doesn't work. Is I guess what I'm saying.
Well, if you describe it like a parasite, you can't kill the host.
Yeah, eventually you kill the host. I mean, eventually the Hobbesian, if the Hobbesian conception were true, I think that what would eventually. Well, it's kind of like eventually, but then in the Hobbesian reality, it's always eventually. So like just the condition we would be in would be mass suicide. I mean, like there would be no longer any reason to exist. I mean, people would, the misery would be total. Total alienation from yourself is complete, in which case you're holding nothing. You have nothing left in reserve except your misery. And that I think is the end result of this playing out. It's hell. I mean, it's what we're talking about, right? So
Hobbes says
this. Hobbes says the world is hell. I mean,
we're in the kingdom of darkness.
Not metaphorically. He says it literally. I mean, that heaven will come. I mean, to the point when he does these silly little theological things he sometimes does. Like the kingdom of God will come later, and certain people will share it, but this world will just continue, and that's what we mean by hell. This world will continue, and that's hell. I mean, that's what we're in. And so I think it fails. So you see what I'm saying? Like, I think this is the reason why you get the cycles of regime forms, right? Where you have, like we talked about in the last series, where you have a realm of goodness, a realm of friendship at some point. And, think about Plato begins it with the love and fraternity of the warrior band, of the aristocratic guys whose friendships are real, and therefore they have power. Like they have a world that they share for real, like they actually share a world. And then that's steadily eroded until you get to the radical individualism of tyranny. And the radical individualism of tyranny is ultimately where everybody's a slave and everybody's a mercenary, and then it falls, right? And so it's already that regime, that conception that it's not just undesirable, the sovereign order, it's unrealizable.
Yes.
Right. So it fails. It's not the case that it ever actually exists.
It's almost well, it's in that sense, then it is an ideological structure for an elite to construct the gaps between the peoples in order to organize a nation state.
Yeah,
right?
basically that's what it is.
I mean, that's what, in essence, that's what sovereignty accomplisches, is a certain elite theory to...
It's an elite theory about, and this goes to the idea that that in an unjust society, the different groups are occupying different worlds with different values and different conceptions of the truth. And what theories of sovereignty allow is the ones with power to view the structures of human life beneath them, so the families, the villages, the communities, as not as anything that has a good in of itself, or anything that has something directly to do with human flourishing, but rather as merely other power structures, right? Merely as other, rival sovereigns, only little ones and kind of weak ones, so we can crush them. right? And not only can we, but we ought to, because they're oppressive and they're unjust, and the patriarchy is evil, and this and that, and like all the reasons why the smaller power structures are just like us, only bad, and we're the ones who are good because our world is the way where we get true and false justice, just and unjust, right? And therefore the expansion of our power over and against all those other things is justified morally. And the only reason why I have to do that is because, again, Hobbes is wrong, because even within the social world of the sovereign grouping, the so-called sovereign grouping, they have justice, which is what Plato says about the band of thieves. Right? So what they've done is expanded that to, like what I mean is that the conceptions of sovereignty and the ideologies that go along with it always seem to be applied to the other and not to yourself. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, right.
It's okay for us to expand into this space because that's the way they are. But it's good. It's good for us
to do that. Yeah. Exactly. and for subsidiarity, then it's in a sense, it's the liberation of the family to be itself, for those friendships and those relationships to grow. And in the opposite way with sovereignty, this elite state structure it's fearful of the lower. It's fearful of all the groupings of power that are not incorporated. It's fearful of the fact that they're not individualized enough and that they still have love for the groupings that are smaller, right? Like
that's right. Yeah.
It's the elites on the coast afraid of the Midwest. Just
totally. I mean, you see it so obviously that it's like you see it so obviously there's like parodies in it.
Yeah.
Right. It's like a parody. It's like when we were back in the COVID disaster nightmare, right? When you could see in the hatred, the visceral hatred of the families that got together for Thanksgiving.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, you hate these people. This has nothing to do with the disease, man. You hate the fact that they love each other.
That right? They have a Thanksgiving.
And that they have Thanksgiving. And like that makes your skin crawl. Do you know? And like the reason is because it's a threat to you. Right? Like the reason is like because you're perceiving a world that doesn't rely upon your power structure. Like here's a world that like our whole big bureaucratic governmental corporate thing could just like go away and these people would still have Thanksgiving. And it's like, yeah. Right? That's terrifying.
Send the police.
What if they decide to get together and base some sort of revolution on the importance of Thanksgiving? And it was like, we would have no way to stop them. Right? And that needs to be what happened with the COVID is that they could see it, and then they had the moral justification they needed to hate it, right? And so they do. But the initial hatred, I think, is just mostly aesthetic. It's mostly just like, I perceive that as ugly and threatening because it's a structure of peace or a structure of social cohesion that lays outside of my world. And therefore, I perceive it as both a threat and as a place of possible expansion.
And in a sense, the elite's world is so dependent on the structure above it that they've been individualized. They've made the concessions. They're
approaching the Hobbesian person.
They're approaching the Hobbesian person.
Slave. Yeah,
and it's the fear of the ones who are not fully dependent on the above, right? Who actually have subsidiarity structures that are possessed there.
Yeah, who for example, that their submission to the entity in the gaps is highly conditional.
Yeah.
Right, like
they go too far.
I'm willing to submit to the thing in the gaps because I love my family and my community, and I'm willing to play along for the goods that it can provide or the protection that's necessary, but it hasn't penetrated yet into the soul the way Foucault will describe. Like my submission hasn't become total. Do you know, or more total, and therefore I'm perceived as restive. By the power structure, like I'm perceived as we're not quite sure about these guys yet, right? Like they go to work every day, they're paying their taxes, but they seem to have like values and loves and things that they think are more important than those things, right? And therefore they're a problem. Now, in a subsidiarity, just society of justice, that's the very condition of peace. Like the ruler's very objective is to see those places of human flourishing, those places of happiness, those places of friendship, and there's still the gaps between them. But instead of setting up shop in the gaps in order to expand them and dominate them, the just ruler comes into those gaps in order to unite people. Do you see what I'm saying? Like in order to bring together into larger groupings of friends, and to be a mediator that makes those larger groupings of friends possible, right?
And create the harmony there.
Which is the way like a parent works with the siblings, right? It's like the horizontal piece between the siblings is not dependent upon it comes to be real, but its initial or its sort of mode of coming real, or it's the dynamic that makes it come real is the shared love of the parent, right? And that parent then operates as a third that allows for the horizontal discourses and friendships to have a space, right? A space of love based upon love where they can grow. And so true authority, just authority, operates in that way. That's its objective, which is the diametric opposite of the sort of power that a sovereign would like to wield.
Widening the gaps.
Widening the gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to, as we kind of move towards closing the discussion, bring it to the contemporary, and maybe the question that, you know, we raised in the last episode of the Politics of Paganism, which was the new political right.
Oh boy.
Pagan or Christian. So for the last, since Trump's election in 2016, and we can go back to Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, and, for New Polity starting during the COVID times and afterwards, that there has been this very large discussion on the right about political order. And you mentioned some of the figures in your introduction. Of course, our whole series was addressed towards the Nietzscheans. BAP, you mentioned Curtis Yarvin. And one of the things that's very fascinating reading your introduction to this book is that your really ultimately the critique of everyone in it is that they're still stuck, and this perhaps is because of they're coming from the elite. They are still stuck in the logic of sovereignty. They haven't fully gotten out of that individual first claim of Hobbes that then you enter into sociality. Of course, we saw this clearly with BAP, who asserts in Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy that man is first a private animal before he is a public one, which is just Hobbesian. Yeah. In the same way with Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land, it still is in an individualized structure that he just views it as the ideal situation is under a monarch who organizes all the individuals. So we're back to the same bureaucracy. Yep. And in addition, Vermeulen with Common Good Constitutionalism, where he basically entirely inverts subsidiarity to basically be
the opposite,
the service to the top. It's just so absurd. I remember reading it for the first time, just like, how in the world could he get it so wrong?
I couldn't believe it.
But of course, but what the new political right, if I could summarize it, it seemed to be aimed towards basically, and even Deneen in Regime Change talks about this, we're going to occupy the exact same sovereign structure that has been constructed for the last, since the post-war era. We're going to occupy the exact same structure as them and use the power in the exact same way. Use the power in a right-wing way, in a conservative way. And
it's something that New Polity we've been trying to point out for many years, that it's like having half the insight and not the second half, right? Like seeing how, like coming to stop being naive about the political world in which we live and seeing the dynamics in play and seeing how it works, but then not understanding that the alternative is a true alternative, right? Like the alternative isn't Like what you're not, what you're, so part of the problem is this, is that I think there's a very, one of the things that happens in modernity, I think, is that the classical insight about regime forms is forgotten. And what regime forms, different forms of regime comes to mean is just different constitutions of tyranny, right? Mm-hmm. Like different ways of organizing tyranny. And that's not the insight, the classical insight about regime forms. The classical insight about regime forms is that the form, the structural form, the form of the regime is indivorcible. It's integral to it is the spiritual, moral structure of the people, so that the virtues and vices of the people are not secondary to, and are not just merely the result of the political structures, but are actually integral to what those political structures are. And the reason why that's really important is that the rules themselves of how human beings interact changes within different regime forms. Right? It's not like you've determined. It's the Hobbesian thing to think, I figured out how human beings behave. Right? They behave in self-interested and rational ways, and laws conform people to habituate to the laws, and virtues and vices are nothing other than the habituation to the laws, and blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. It's like, no. You're describing the way human beings behave to the extent they live in a tyranny. And it is true, right? That's good analysis, right? That is happening. But what you're not seeing, what you're not understanding is that the movement into other regime forms is actually movements into different ways of human behavior. Like the human beings who live within a just society and are just behave differently. Like the mechanisms that work in a tyrannical society don't work in a just society, right? And vice versa. So there's a lack of appreciation for just how radical different regime forms in fact are, how radically different they are, I should say, right? And so you have the idea of, well, look, the centralized, bureaucratic, elite-driven structure is capable of habituating people into wickedness. Therefore, it's capable of habituating people into goodness. It's like, well, no, that doesn't follow. Those two things don't follow. Right?
Well, right. You're making a means end. Like, we're going to use the exact same means to a different end. It's like,
what you're basically arguing is you're, again, like we've been saying, is that you're staying within the modern framework where you're supposing there to be neutrality, right? Neutrality in structure, neutrality in form, so that the relationship of form and ends is extrinsic and not intrinsic. So you're saying that the political entity is neutral towards ends. It's like, well, that's liberalism. Right? Like that's the heart of liberalism, is that the political entity is neutral towards ends. Not that it's neutral in any given instance. You can say, no, it's always aimed at some end, sure. But it's neutral in its form, meaning it can be aimed at any end. Right? That's not a repudiation of liberalism. It's a repudiation of one of the components of liberalism, right? That it can be neutral in its actual operation, sure. But it's not the more fundamental ground for liberalism, which is the idea that the political world is neutral as such, like in its essential being, it's a neutral thing, right? That's not that is I believe that's not classical political philosophy. I think classical political philosophy knows that's not true. Certainly, Christian political philosophy knows that's not true. So it's one of these things where I feel like I've been arguing this for many years now, and I think one of the reasons why my argument is frustrating for people is because they don't then know what we're supposed to do with it. Like, well, what am I supposed to do then?
Maybe stuff like, you're now in charge of the Department of Education. Dismantling.
Yeah. No, I know. I was talking to Mark Barnes the other day, and he said something about, do you think we should do like a victory lap here? I mean, because the idea that getting control of the forces within the gaps and then destroying them is the thing to do. Like dismantle it, get power over it. Absolutely.
Okay,
Integrate
yeah,
from
yeah.
within, whatever. Like
So the
whatever
structures
you
that are
wanna-
constructing the gaps, maybe get in there and then destroy the things that are making the gaps between people.
Yeah. Destroy it.
Yeah.
Dismantle it. Turn it into something else. And actually into something else if you can, right? But at least dismantle the war machine, like the internal war machine.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like, I mean, it's always dangerous when you're talking about like contemporary politics, but it feels like there's a force within the current Trump regime or administration that is motivated exactly by that. There's something charming about the whole thing where it's like, where people are this guy and this guy, secretary so-and-so, aren't qualified to run these departments, aren't qualified. And it's like, well, are they qualified to be hatchet men? It's they're not qualified to run the bureaucracy, but are they qualified to destroy it?
Yeah. Well, and this is the big difference. I remember during the campaign trail when he talked about the neocons being his enemy, and I was like, whoa, where do we come from, right? Like, because it was first administration, it was Phil. I don't think he really understood, filling the cabinet with kind of neocon. Neocon types, but now it's take the hatchet to all of it, and it's very interesting because it seems like those two directions that you're laying out in the book between subsidiarity and sovereignty, that these are our options in front of us politically, and that the structures that have been occupied both by right-wing neocon elites and by liberal elites have been occupying a structure of sovereignty that they've been increasing.
They've been trying to build. Right?
And an Atlanticist, NATO expansionist, foreign policy, imperial liberalism.
Yeah, globalized economics, the whole thing.
Democracy in Baghdad and in Kabul. Yeah. They've been pursuing that both on the neocon right and on the very progressive liberal left.
Yeah.
And in addition, the global corporations who will move to many different countries and displace the American worker.
The whole
mass migration.
I was just going to say mass migration, which is obviously targeted not only at the disruption of any pockets of solidarity within the United States, but also the destruction of solidarity among the migrants.
Right.
Like, to be taken out of their place and put into a place where they're completely dependent upon the elite's power structure.
The development of a client state.
Right?
Oh yeah,
exactly.
I mean, Botero describes it.
I mean, this feels obvious. Yeah.
Yeah. It's you bring in those who are completely dependent. I mean, of everyone who. What's easier, to widen the gaps between the people already here, or to basically
bring people in who are already totally atomized?
It's 100% a gap that can only be filled by the above.
Yeah.
And so. And I don't even think many of this is controversial at this point. I think all of it's becoming very apparent.
Yeah,
like before, it kind of seemed kind of seems like you were out on a limb, and now it's right in front of us. So, well, what is the answer to that? The answer then has to be, according to the lines you laid out, of it can only really happen through reconstituting subsidiarity and by dismantling the sovereign structures that are widening the gaps between people. And that seems to be the direction it's going.
It's literally, I'm like, when I talked about mining the value out of the structures of peace and solidarity that exist, and that's what it's like. That's not just like a metaphor, right? I mean, like literally, the way in which the scraping of the economic surplus of just like of wealth out of the population, centralizing it into the DC machine, and then redistributing it into the sea of not only governmental agencies, but all the NGOs and nonprofits that are basically extensions of that same ruling class, right? Like that is literally, I mean, like the project is actually the sucking out of the strength of that which isn't dependent on you and building that which is. Right, like that's actually what's going on, and so the destruction of that, right, and which almost as an act of, it's almost inevitable, I think. It's almost like natural, like maybe the natural dynamic that as you destroy that what you're doing is providing space for the subsidiarity, the always present drive towards subsidiarity, towards justice, to expand into that space.
And there's one more, and maybe we'll move to closing with this, but there's an element here of American bravery that, and you draw it out in the preface, that doing that exact structure of mining from the American people to then give it to a DC elite and then construct totally dependent things on you.
Yeah.
That's not brave.
Right?
No, like that's very fearful. That's not even really American. It feels very European sovereign state.
Yeah,
and it feels fearful. It's fearful of
you're not
really the American people.
You're not willing to risk the other.
You're not willing
to be
to
friends.
risk.
You're not willing. Yeah, the other is dangerous because he has power. So I'm going to build walls against him. I'm going to suck his power. I'm going to try to do all. I'm scared of him. I'm a coward.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Whereas the American impulse towards freedom is completely bound up with bravery. Like if you're not willing, and this is, and love. I mean, like being willing to risk the other is a willingness, is what it is saying, I'm going to love you until you prove otherwise. I mean, you know what I mean? I'm going to be your friend until we're enemies. But I'm going to be your friend first, not the other way around. Do you know?
Yep.
And that's the posture of courage.
Yes. And the preface to your book, you say, what I, looking at the project as a whole and the book as a whole, what I'm doing is I'm really defending America.
Yeah.
And so this isn't, basically that sovereign liberalism doesn't have a stranglehold over America. It's part of the realization of that this isn't the essential part of us as a people.
Right.
It's in prep for us with the conference.
Yeah.
And it's that American bravery to actually go through and dismantle those structures in order to
risk what's going to happen.
Risk what's going to happen.
I mean, we're unleashing things that we can't control.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's exciting. We'll see
go.
what happens. Well, that's great. Well, yeah, this is a major accomplishment, and just congratulations for it.
Thank you.
If you want to get it, you can get it at newpolity.com/press. It's available. I will physically ship it to you in 2 to 3 days. So you can find it there. Also wanted to say we have our conference coming up, May 29th to 31st. Tickets are still available, coming soon. So you can find that at newpolity.com/events. So thank you, Andrew.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you in the next one.